Hello, everybody. Good morning to some, good afternoon to most, and good evening to others. Welcome to the webinar series, HIV and Faith in Resilience and Renewal, where today's discussion is being co-sponsored by the 11th International Conference on Stigma. My name is Ulysses Burley, founder of UB The Cure LLC, and I am again honored to serve as moderator for today's conversation. HIV and Faith in Resilience and Renewal is a webinar series developed by the U.S. HIV and AIDS Faith Coalition. The series explores the 40-year legacy of United States faith communities toward ending the HIV and AIDS epidemic. It features conversations with a variety of leaders from faith-based organizations, houses of worship, community organizations, and government agencies who address the intersections of race, class, gender, sex, sexuality, and religion in the history of the HIV response in the United States. And identify lessons learned, offer insights, and share their vision for what will be needed to end the epidemic as a public health crisis. The event centers the commentary of faith actors from multiple faith traditions and practices, people living with HIV, and HIV practitioners who have been involved in the HIV and AIDS advocacy since the beginning of the epidemic. Our first conversation explored the history of the Black Church's response to HIV and AIDS, where Carrie Goodman and Dr. Pernessa Seal walked us through the maturation of the National Week of Prayer for the Healing of AIDS. Our second in this HIV and Faith in Resilience and Renewal series featured Reverend Edwin Sanders and Khadija Abdullah in a conversation centered around the emergence and observance of National Faith HIV and AIDS Awareness Day. For our third dialogue in the series, Jesse Milan and Rabbi Denise Edgar had a casual cafe conversation, if you will, on the importance of faith coalitions then and now in the HIV and AIDS epidemic response. I'm pleased to introduce our guest today, who will lead us in our fourth HIV and Faith in Resilience and Renewal conversation focused on reaching vulnerable communities. Erica Poellot, MSW MDiv, is the Senior Ministry Innovator at Judson Memorial Church in New York City. As a faith leader engaged in a long-term healing process from substance use disorder, Erica founded Faith in Harm Reduction to co-create a justice movement which connects people who use drugs, people who trade sex, and communities of faith through the development of harm reduction-centered spiritual resources, ritual support, and spiritual care. With joint MDiv MSW degrees from Union Theological Seminary and Columbia University in New York City, Erica currently works as the Director of Faith and Community Partnerships for National Harm Reduction Coalition and coordinates the Overdose and Drug Use Ministries for the United Church of Christ. Reverend Michael J. Crumpler works as the LGBTQ and Multicultural Program Director at the Unitarian Universalist Association and is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. Michael lives in Harlem and is very active in social justice ministry at the historic Judson Memorial Church of New York City, where he served as president of the board from 2016 to 2018. He is most passionate about the intersectional ministries centered in Blackness, queerness, HIV and AIDS, economic justice, and emotional well-being. After what I'm certain will be a fruitful conversation between Reverend Crumpler and Ms. Poellot, we will have responses from Reverend Dr. Orisha Bowers and Kamal Fazazi to offer reflections on what they heard and in the context of their own experiences with faith coalitions addressing HIV and AIDS. Orisha Bowers, PhD, is the Regional Director at National Harm Reduction Coalition. She is a lifelong community advocate, educator, and leader. Dr. Bowers also is an ordained minister and combines her love for women's health, rights, and justice with research and interdisciplinary studies to continue to creatively transform the community for universal liberation. Finally, strategic planning consultant Kamal Fazazi's mission is to defend advance, and promote justice, fairness, and healing reconciliation. As a Muslim, he is committed to human rights, social justice, and liberation for all. He is particularly passionate about diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging, race, gender, and sexuality, stigma, mental health, and HIV, and faith and interfaith anti-oppression organizing. Currently board president of Eastern African Sexual Health and Rights Initiative of the USA, Kamal formerly served on the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity's steering committee. Listen, folks, we have a dynamic lineup for you today, and I want to thank all of our speakers in advance for what I know will be valuable contributions. At this time, I invite Reverend Crumpler and Ms. Poellot to share more about their very important work for reaching vulnerable communities in response to HIV and AIDS. They will be followed by our two respondents, and then we'll open the floor for written questions and comments from our viewers on all platforms. At this time, Reverend Crumpler and Ms. Poellot, the floor is yours.
Hello, Erica.
Hey, Michael. Thank you so much, Ulysses. It's wonderful to be here.
Yes, thank you, Ulysses.
Now, I know we had crafted a few questions that we wanted to use to guide our conversation. And
yes.
I think the first one, Ulysses dove into a fair number of pieces as is, but that is kind of who are we, how we got to the work we do, and what we do. Do you want to start that off, or shall I?
You go.
Perfect. As Ulysses said, I wear quite a number of hats connected to this work, but the one that I think is perhaps the most relevant to this particular conversation, as well as to really the kind of spirit and power within which I do my work, is my experience as a faith leader engaged in an over 20-year healing process from substance use disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. And I mention PTSD as I have come to understand my substance use as an incredibly creative repertoire of strategies I have used to survive and ultimately thrive in the absence of other resources or care for trauma, and in the face of stigma, which was a barrier to care for all of the conditions I talk about above. Trauma, in my experience, was very much my gateway drug, and it wasn't until I was able to obtain safe and secure housing, loving, stigma-free relationships with healers and other health practitioners, and ultimately spiritual community, excuse me, with other people who shared my lived experiences, in which enabled me to show up with my whole self, to be my whole self, and to share and be my whole story. When I found space beyond stigma and shame, I was able to address the core of trauma, access treatment, and renegotiate my relationship with substances. Notably, as a minister, the church did not figure into my healing journey for a very, very long time. Quite the opposite. The church was a site of incredible harm. It never felt like a place where sanctuary could be found, both for what it said and did not say, and the ways in which I knew I was welcomed and not, the ways in which I knew my loved ones and my communities were welcomed and not. I came to understand the church as a place of exclusion, but also as a necessary and potent site of opportunity for transforming a culture of stigma, punishment, and harm for people who use drugs. And as Ulysses mentioned, as a response to these experiences, in collaboration with the National Harm Reduction Coalition, Judson Memorial Church, and people who use drugs, we launched Faith and Harm Reduction with the aim of building bridges between harm reduction and faith communities in order to develop leadership, strengthen advocacy efforts, and build environments supportive of compassionate, evidence-based policies and practices, which seek to build health and wholeness for people who use drugs.
Thank you for that, Erica. I think that a lot of what you said, I certainly identify with. For those of you who probably have made the connection, Erica and I belong to the same church. And I believe that we belong to the same church for the same reasons, some of which Erica named around coming from perhaps a church culture, in my case, the Black church tradition in the South. I was born and raised in North Carolina. You know, just not being very, very connected to church as a, you know, Black Southerner. Church is everything. And while at the same time feeling very disconnected from that experience because of my sexuality, because, you know, knowing from a very early age that I was quote unquote different, and then my growing awareness of that difference creating more stigma, if you will. And so I ended up siloing myself off from my sexuality, from my Christian experience, and then moving, you know, and as I grew up, I became more and more Christian and more quiet, or, you know, discreet, or ashamed of my sexuality. And I think that, you know, thinking that, you know, I was terminally unique, you know, cursed, however you want to call it, ostracized, not loving myself, not because I didn't believe anyone would love me because of those things, just very, very fragmented in my being. And so fast forward to today, it's very, very, very important for me to be engaged in faith communities, faith traditions, where I can have my whole self. I usually begin by just naming what it is. You know, I'm Black, I'm gay, I'm living with HIV. Oftentimes I'll name, you know, in some kind of a way that I am sober, that I am a person who is sober, meaning that I am an addict but I am not using. And so I have found a way to find dignity and respect in what has, you know, generally been stigmatized. And I believe that, you know, that is the work, more so, you know, less so around like, you know, being in the trenches of HIV or being in the trenches of drug use, but really I think the work is finding dignity, giving people a platform and a place to feel welcome, to feel loved, to feel included. You know, I do that for the Unitarian Universalist Association, but I also just do that in my life, you know, just creating space for people to feel whole and to feel loved. I am particularly struck by the way in which, you know, in gay cis male communities where living with HIV is just, you know, for a lot of us, just, you know, just a way of life, just how we are. And it's almost stigmatized if you don't accept it, or if you don't understand it, or if you can't, you know, get over it. And so I'm always intrigued by that, alongside of being Black in a, you know, in what is, like, generally speaking, you know, a white gay male structure where, you know, services are available, there's power that's not necessarily shared, but yet, you know, Black and brown gay men coming into those spaces, often being HIV positive, and having experience with drugs, trying to find dignity, trying to find that same welcome and assurance. And so I'm constantly like engaging those dynamics. Here in the city, I've created a brunch, if you will, of Black gay men, mostly Black gay and trans folks, Black queer and trans folks, who gather together for community and connection, most of whom are living with HIV, most of whom struggling with substances. We don't, you know, and we find connection and community and love in that way. So this conversation very, very much, you know, gives me goosebumps, and I'm really, really excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I had forgotten kind of the brunch piece. I know I'm familiar with some of the other ministries that you support at Judson and beyond, and I'm really just kind of struck by the synergies and some of the language you use to talk about both your own experience with stigma in the context of the church, in the context of these, you know, multiple stigmatized identities, right? And really I think kind of significant opportunity in this moment. And, you know, I'm going to use kind of COVID and the overdose crisis and the resurgence of HIV outbreaks and all this kind of stuff, specifically for folks that I work with, you know, amongst people who use drugs is really where the heart of my ministry lays. But, you know, looking at the opportunity to really build power with, help make space with, co-create spiritual community, and that we do so by allowing folks to, again, share their stories, share our stories, share my story, as well as, you know, really give an opportunity to center the voices of people with lived experience, which I think is, you know, folks quite often ask, you know, where you know, where I take direction from, and it's I believe that people with lived experience of these, you know, variety of you know, experiences are the ones who are the experts and are the ones who are going to help shape shift a future and a culture which does not stigmatize, which does not other, which is not exclusive, but to use the kind of language of, you know, the UCC or my faith tradition, but is, you know, wildly inclusive, is, you know, extravagantly loving. And that means that we are necessarily inviting whole people in, right? And
yeah, and I'm struck by, I love what you said about the, you know, around experience and truth and the power of experience. I think that oftentimes when we're able to, you know, make meaning from our experiences, it's super, super powerful. But that becomes difficult whenever even your own experience isn't normalized. And I think that oftentimes people who use drugs, people who are recovering from drug addiction, a part of, you know, getting sober, staying healthy, and taking care of self is being able to create the narrative. And so I'm very mindful of, you know, just what it means to be gay in the Black community for me. And, you know, and how that, you know, how that stigma, if you will, because it was stigmatized, led me into harmful situations that made me vulnerable to being HIV positive. Whereas before that, I mean, it was always something that I feared, but it was also something that was like over there, like in New York or San Francisco. How did it get to, you know, a young poor boy from like North Carolina, right? Like, how does that, and how that stigma led to secrets, you know, like discrete behavior, sexual behavior in places, you know, where there weren't conversations around safe sex, or where you didn't have the language, where, you know, they were generally anonymous, they were risky already. And then how does that then how you move from there into, you know, substance abuse, drug abuse, crystal meth, heroin, cocaine, crack, marijuana, like how does that all happen? And, you know, and it's all because of stigma. Stigma begats stigma. Stigma becomes compounded. And then out on the other end, how do you get people then who are able to turn around all of that, you know, stigma, complex behavior, you know, harmful behavior, life-endangering behavior into something that is like dignified, something that you're able to name and embrace and be surrounded by people with that same experience who are living full, healthy, wholesome public lives, who are able to say, yes, I'm HIV positive, you know, without even like, you know, a hesitation, and to be engaged in the work of healing and recovery, helping other folks recover from that same experience. I think that that's just really dynamic, and that's something that a lot of people don't get to experience unless you're in that situation.
I think a couple of the pieces, I mean, it's I hear the phrase that kept popping into my mind as you were kind of describing this last piece was, you know, opportunities for life-giving, and that those opportunities for life-giving, as I heard you talk about, were happening in community and in the context of community, in the context of being able to bear witness to one another's wholeness. And I know for my own self, that was a really critical piece. And I've heard that kind of in all the stories that really helped build the work that I do, was there was a very kind of just consistent thread, was that the stigma of substance use and the myriad of associations that go along with that. And quite often they're really, you know, the multiple stigmas that come together with folks who are impacted or have lived experience of substance use. you know, that this really, it created a chasm between connection and community. And we know that for, you know, folks who use drugs, we can talk about just kind of the overdose issue right now, that isolation, that shame, that breathed isolation is death dealing. People
Yes.
die because they don't have somebody else there to help reverse an overdose. Overdoses are entirely preventable, but we have over 72,000 people a year. This year, substantially more that are dying because they are stigmatized, because they are ashamed, because they are isolated. And, you know, so I think we have a really, you know, I feel like as people of faith, we have a calling to help challenge these narratives and to recraft narratives that include people who use drugs in the community of the beloved, which, you know, like I said, center their expertise, center their wisdom, and take our lead from these folks.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think in order for that to happen, particularly, I mean, I know I come from a faith where it was a theology of holiness, really, and it was a theology of you know, of really, like, I mean, I grew up in the South where you couldn't smoke, you couldn't drink, you couldn't dance, you couldn't wear makeup, you couldn't wear pants, you couldn't do a lot of things, and you know, and nobody could have sex, much less, you know, be gay and have sex. I mean, there was no sex happen for anyone, and so that was the theology that I grew up in. But then within that theology, or alongside of that theology, was a theology of love. It was a theology of being around the dinner table. It was a theology of the minister coming over on Sunday and eating first. It was a theology of helping one another out, a theology of liberation, if you will, of Black people finding, you know, connection and solidarity amid, you know, a culture of racism and segregation and inferiority. And so, like, in those, you know, almost like the Russian doll phenomenon, inside of the thing is inside of the thing, and inside of the thing. And because the community bonds was so strong, you know, anything that was othering, you know, had to be hidden, and it had to be done in secret. And today, you know, my theology isn't again completely devoid of Black liberation, but it's you know, a redefining of where, you know, what is it about church? What is it about community? What is it about, you know, the theology that lifts up? And it's a theology of community and a theology of concern. And then just grafting in, like, okay, so then how do I do that in the gay community? How do I do that as a Black man living with HIV? How do I do that as someone who knows of a subculture where crystal meth addiction, cocaine addiction, heroin addiction, crack addiction is an epidemic, you know? And so what does it look like to recover from those? And I think that, like, as you said, it's the faith piece. It's people, and not faith in or belief in a particular creed, but faith in, like, humanity, faith in yourself, faith in the dignity of your own experience and identity.
Yeah, I think that humanity piece is what rings perhaps the most potent to me, is you know, and kind of looking at and hearing the experiences of folks connected to a lot of the work I do, is that, you know, or even thinking about the language that is used to talk about folks, looking at policies that have been developed, right? So we're talking about the war on people who use drugs and our rates of incarceration, and just all of this is, you know, we have dehumanized people who have experience with substance use disorder. And I'm going to push back a little bit on the, you know, it's incredible, I think, I did not have that same experience with church until I came to a place like Judson. I mean, I was pretty certain that this that did not exist, or it definitely did not exist in the circles I was part of. But I found spiritual community originally in 12-step fellowships, and, you know, and that changed over time as I started witnessing, again, friends and others who, you know, abstinence was not part of their pathway to healing, and who were excluded from those spaces. And you know, I was in a conference earlier this weekend and listened to a colleague who is a faith leader talk about the challenges that he has no space or place within which to talk about his own history of substance use. We take drug tests to be employed with the UCC. I'm sorry, I'm adding the UCC on that one, because we make assumptions about employability of people who use drugs and all these things, but there's some really kind of significant structural stigmas.
No, I mean, I hear you in that regard. I mean, I certainly too, I've had success in 12-step programs, but I'm not at all, I'm very mindful of the Christian supremacy that abides within 12-step programs, and where the same stigma that oftentimes characterizes the Christian experience, the Christian church, is also found in the rooms, whereby relapse is something that is stigmatized, where if you don't get it all the way, and then certainly we say keep coming back, but we certainly reward and award and privilege those who are able to never use again or have long time sobriety. And I think that again, in that construct, it is important to just be mindful of how harmful that is. I mean, what is it? 1 in 10 people ever make it to recovery, and of those who make it, 1 in 10 actually stay. And then to stay is considered to be sober for 2 to 5 years. And so it is like 1/10 of 1/10. And so there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of stigma attached to it. I mean, a lot of in our society, a lot of what it means to be sober or to have sustained society is to become a functioning member of society. Well, what does that mean, right? Like, when a lot of your behavior is still stigmatized, even once you become a functioning member of society. I mean, I might be sober, but I will always have HIV, and I will always be Black. So what does it mean to find meaning amidst all of that? And how can we encourage people to encourage, I don't think the problem of stigma is amongst those who are victims. I believe that the problem of stigma is much amongst the greater society. And so how can we, I'm constantly working to normalize what it means to be living with HIV. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of that has to do with policies, healthcare policies, laws around adoption and same-sex families and so forth and so on, employment, the Equality Act and all of that engages. So there's just a lot there, and I think that the what I would call the outer community or the broader community has a lot of work to do to decrease stigma, and which will impact drug use, which will impact people being able to live healthy with HIV.
Yeah, I like that piece. And I was thinking about, kind of even as I was thinking through what we might chat about today, given the questions that we had put out, started kind of finding myself stumbling with some of this language around like vulnerable communities. Like communities are made vulnerable. Communities
exactly
are made vulnerable by systems and power and all these things. And then looking too at kind of, as you're talking about, as somebody who also identifies as being queer, and really feel the call to queer notions of recovery. I think that we have just really painfully limited the ways that we understand this. I mean, even just to look at, it's like Samson's definition is around like any positive change and moves towards wellness and wholeness and all of this. It says nothing about my drug use. It says nothing about my drug use. It talks about my relationship with self, with others, with meaning. You talked about this kind of opportunity for meaning making. And so what does it look like if we're able to queer these kind of understandings of recovery, and do so in conversation with people who have these experiences? I don't know, that continues to feel like, again, a real potent opportunity.
Oh no, yeah, I love that. I mean, people are made vulnerable by systems, and they're not just, generally the term systems relates to a government agency or a government program or a government, but I think that there are social systems. There are mentalities. I mean, honestly, like I feel more comfortable walking into a government agency and talking about being HIV positive than I feel walking into like, you know, my family's dining room.
Sure.
Talking about it. There are social systems and structures that people move in. And, you know, I mean, outside of the gay ghetto, it's really difficult to articulate what it means to be living with HIV. Recently, and I'll wrap up here in a moment. Recently, I reconnected with a family member who said to me, you know, who hadn't seen me since my positive diagnosis almost 10 years ago. And he was like, so how you doing? And I'm just like, I'm doing good. And he's like, no, how you doing? You know, remember before? And I'm just like, I almost didn't know what he was talking about because things had changed so much. I'm like, oh yeah, great. Yeah, I'm perfectly fine, perfectly healthy. But even still, like that conversation amongst a really close family member can still be very difficult. And I think that that's not my problem. You know, I didn't create that. That is a larger problem that abides in our families and in our faiths and in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you all so much for this. What a powerful conversation. I was deeply moved by your vulnerability. And I can tell you from some of the reactions in the chat, you all have inspired others as well to share their stories through your stories. And so really grateful for this conversation and looking forward to how it might help others to work through these very sensitive but very real issues, especially this year, you know, as we've all been forced inside of our homes, we've been forced apart from each other, and what kinds of ramifications does that have in the ways in which we cope and maintain with the world around us? And so really appreciate for you all sharing, and I want to now invite Kamal and Dr. O into the conversation to tell us what they heard and how what they heard relates to the important work that they're currently doing in terms of reaching vulnerable populations as well. So Dr. O, I will give you the floor, followed by Kamal.
Sure. I think the thing that stood out to me most poignantly was when you both shared your hearts around your experiences with places of faith and people of faith early in your story. We really, as faith leaders, have to be mindful of our impact on people and how we receive people. People come to places of faith, they're looking for something. It varies depending upon where we meet them. But I think that is one of the key components of how we do our work at harm reduction is of meeting people where they are. That means for me as a faith leader and a community advocate to really listen to people when they're telling me their story and what they are coming to me for, and knowing, you know, whether or not I can connect them with what they need, you know, putting my own stuff aside, because you can really do a lot of harm to people if you are not able to meet them where they are, or bring these attitudes that could put scars on people for their lives. And so I think that is what really resonates with me in terms of how I try to do my work related to that. Is really about just listening more than I talk. You know, my grandmother used to say it jokingly, but as I've grown older and realized that she really was on to something very important when she used to say, you have two ears and one mouth for a reason, because you need to listen twice as much as you talk in life. And that is really where my work really starts with people, is just listening. Just listening. Sometimes you can just learn a lot from just listening. Jump in, Kamal.
All right, thank you so
Thank you,
much,
Craig.
Dr. O. I want to thank everybody who's spoken, Reverend Michael and Erica, and for asking me to join. I'm going to say a few things, but definitely want to remind everyone that I'm speaking for myself, from my experience, but not just in my experience as someone living with HIV in recovery with a history of trauma, with complex trauma, CPTSD, and other issues, but also as a Muslim who's Sunni, and I want to name that, and from Morocco and with an Andalusian heritage. Like, there's like all this stuff which maybe makes a difference and maybe doesn't. But I feel like I'm a bridge between the two of you, because I have experience in both the harm reduction world and 12-step abstinence model. And the stigma, for me, like, I had to come to learn that definitely my trauma was underlying a lot of my, what I might call acting out. Like, there was feelings that I didn't know how to express or find safety from, find comfort for, or find connection to cure, that led to behaviors that led to risk or exposure to risk and vulnerability, as well as I had internalized a lot of the messages from those structures that we talked about, and the individuals who carried them, that said that I wasn't worthy, that I didn't matter, that my life didn't matter, that my health didn't matter, all those things. And so the work that I do has been to kind of reverse that from a personal, like, my understanding. There's a saying in Islam, there's a hadith, which is a prophetic saying of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that people were asking him, what should we do about oppression in the world? And he said, we should, sorry for that noise in the background, it's New York City. We should help the oppressors, and we should help the oppressed, and we should help the oppressors. And the response from the community was, we understand how and why we should help the oppressed, but how and why should we help the oppressors? It's like, how do we help the oppressor? And the response is by preventing them from oppressing. And there was, for me, a sense in that statement that we all belong. Like, everybody is worthy of help, everybody is human, that this hurts the people who are harming as much as the people who are harmed. And also a recognition that I did in some of my healing work, that those who were my harmers were harmed themselves before. Now, one of the things I found challenging in some of the healing work that I did originally was that there seemed to almost be a rush to the point of, look at your own responsibility and forgive the people who harmed you, without recognizing, I have pain here and I was harmed, and it's okay to feel pain and angry and resentments and everything else before rushing to a place of forgiveness for the other, or of only looking at my responsibility. So another thing I want to say about all this is that I had to learn that some of this experience, some of the trauma or some of the use maybe was interrupted grieving, right? That there was a process of grief and pain that hadn't been addressed enough, and a seeking of connection and community, that a lot of the acting out was seeking connection, just desperately seeking. It's like looking for love in all the wrong places, right? And in terms of stigma, the groups that I've worked with are sexual minorities, so to speak, LGBTQIA, but then also people who don't identify with those community names, but maybe have behaviors, sex workers, people who have used drugs, all of that. I'm a human rights lawyer and consultant. So for me, it's been in that framework, but that very much grew out of kind of my Islamic theology, the theology that I had, which as Dr. Burley read in the bio, my sense of commitment to justice, social justice, human rights, and liberation is for all, where a more conservative Muslim perspective might be for all our siblings in Islam, right? Like, there might be like, you're my sister or brother or sibling in Islam. The rest of the people, well, they need to find the light. But that's not the Islam that I was raised with, and it's not the Islam that a majority of people that I know practice. There's the last thing I think I want to bring in, because I know that I want to share the time. There's a saying in Islam, in Arabic, la darar wa la dirar, which basically means we're not supposed to harm ourselves, harm others, and we're not supposed to respond with harm to others. And it's a basis of a lot of harm reduction that in Muslim majority countries where I've done some work allows needle exchanges, allows distribution of condoms in prison, allows all kinds of things where even though the larger public policy might be against drug use, might be against, speaking of practices and policies, and that might be against same-sex sexual relations and all sex work, all kinds of things like that, the recognition that it is a greater harm to let HIV and other diseases spread. And it's not about a general population versus, innocent victims and the guilty ones. It's just a sense that there's harm done when we let these infections and pandemics rage that needs to be contained and constrained. So there's so many more things I could say about all of this, but I'm so curious to hear more. Thank you for.
Well, thanks to all of you. I too was listening as you were all speaking and really resonated with some of the principles that you all raised up. Kamal, specifically about the relationship between those who are oppressed and those who oppress. I really liked how, you mentioned, we have to heal both of those groups of people. I liken it to this idea of bound liberation, right? And that those who are oppressing people, have to keep a certain level of intention in holding those people down. And likewise, those who are being oppressed are being held down. And so in the sense, if you think about it in that way, both the oppressor and the oppressed have to be freed in order for everybody to be liberated, right? And so, there's this idea of bound liberation that our freedom is joined, because in order to continue to oppress people, it takes a certain level of captivity to that ideal, and so not just those who are oppressed who need to be freed, both the oppressor and the oppressor. I really appreciated that. I want to encourage those who are participating to begin to ask questions in the question and answer function of the chat if you have them, but I also want to ask you all, given the year that we've had, and now what we know about COVID-19 pandemic, we've been forced to stay apart for our health, for the health of our community and our neighbors. We've been told to shelter in place, to quarantine ourselves. And basically we've been rendered to a state of isolation throughout the year. And we know that isolation can have adverse effects on our mental health. And we know that, one of the ways in which we cope with those adverse effects are through substance use. And so I'm wondering how you all have maintained your sobriety throughout the year, and what are some best practices that people who are in similar situations, and even people who aren't, because listen, I've struggled being in my home. I've struggled having to log into and look at people through a screen, every day. I'm a very tactile person. I speak for a living. I enjoy being able to be in front of people and to smell and to see and to feel. And so it has been a struggle for me. And, running has been something that has helped me. And, spending time with my families. But what are some best practices that you can offer for persons who have particularly been devastated by the isolation of the year, and find their freedom, their liberation, their coping mechanism in the use of substances, and as the COVID cases tick up again, and the country maybe is even on the verge of yet another lockdown, what are some best practices that you can share with folks so that we can make it out of 2020, but then make it through 2021?
Yeah, I'll hop in. Connection. Some folks I hear have pods, not me. I'm like in the house. I'm like in the house. But and I connect with the running. I think that I think I brushed upon earlier that folks who feel isolated, particularly, you know, gay men, find connection through sex, through the hookups, through apps. And then that, you know, then that kind of comes up against drug use. That's just how it is. You know, that's just the T on what happens. And all of a sudden that's been completely shut down, you know? And I think that, I mean, there are sexual communities that are having COVID safe connections. But ultimately I think that, you know, I have been able to just check in with folks on Zoom and, you know, like at a social distance outside in the park or what have you, just check in with folks and staying connected. Many 12-step meetings are now online on Zoom. And for some people have witnessed to the fact that like they're more sober now than before because it's so easy. You know, it's not like, you know, getting up, putting on clothes, getting on the train, going into a new building and being with people in a very unbalanced way, right? Because those who are comfortable in the space tend to socialize, tend to like congregate together, and those who are new are kind of on the outer edges. Zoom has a way of like making spaces much more accessible and equitable when the heck, all you got is your square, you know, and a private chat. And so because of now like everyone's virtual technological competence has been up a lot, has been improved and increased, more people are able to stay sober than not, you know. And certainly a lot of my friends are struggling with relapsing and drugs and finding meaning and so forth. But I think that on the most part, it's about being connected. And I know I have like not a meeting time, but like times in the week where I just meet with friends, like every Thursday at 6, so just get on this Zoom. Or, you know, every Monday morning, every other Monday morning at 9, you know, meeting with my sponsor, like doing those things and staying connected.
Yeah, I agree incredibly with the connection piece. And another piece that I think rings very true to me is I think there has been this expectation, I've had this expectation of myself that because I'm not commuting, that because I'm not doing all these things, that I should be that much more capable of, you know, having these Zoom marathons, as well as, you know, supporting my daughter, teaching my daughter who's doing Zoom school, which is another whole magical piece of crazy that I don't care to get in, but has been a real challenge this year. But so for me, self-compassion has been critical, as well as providing or finding opportunities to truth tell. I mean, it's to be able to talk to other folks and say, like, you know what, like, I feel like I'm failing at the mother thing. I feel like I'm failing at the minister thing. I feel like I'm failing at the work thing right now. And maybe I am inclined to have more glasses of wine than really I ought to, or I had made agreements with myself about doing so. Self-compassion, opportunities to share that with somebody. And in a lot of cases, it's been opportunities or providing opportunities for other people to do the same things, right? I know Orisha and I, at the beginning of the when folks were lockdown was happening, and we were hearing very clearly from our folks that there was a just real terror and fear in the isolation being imposed upon them, and what that meant for their safety, what that meant for their mental health, and all these pieces. And so we explored kind of in partnership with you know, people who do sex work, who all of a sudden have lost their livelihood, and people who, you know, use drugs, who rely on, again, kind of peers being around for safety and for, you know, helping manage drug supply and stuff like this, which has been totally thrown into chaos during this time, as well as, you know. So we crafted a kind of a spiritual gathering space called Hope, Love, Gather, which really was just an opportunity for folks to come together, be seen, be heard, not be seen if they didn't want to be on camera, whatever it be, but just to be able to be present with other folks. And so I think really finding opportunities to help co-create those has been a real lifesaver for myself anyways.
Thanks so much for that. Kamal, please.
Sure, I was just going to jump in and say a couple things that I've heard that I would definitely say I would add to is ritual or routine. Some people said routine, but since we're talking about faith, I would add in ritual, different rituals, whatever they are for you, personalized and other things. Affirmations. There was an interfaith service I went to once where somebody closed with a prayer that I really took to heart, which is in 3 simple sentences: I belong, I am held, I am loved. And to remind myself, like that, I used to remind myself, I am part of creation. I'm intentionally, like, I believe in a creator. I'm part of creation, intentionally here for a reason. I'm held, that creator holds me through things that I go through and is witnessing with me what I'm experiencing. And I'm loved by that creator. Maybe that love is not exactly it's not the love of a parent who like makes sure I don't fall down at times, like, but it's still there. Like, I'm loved no matter what. And that's something that didn't necessarily match with some of the spirituality I was raised with, right? Sometimes I didn't have that message. And then the last piece, which I did learn from 12-step, was service, helping others. That there's a process, whether it's taking care of, I'm reminded that I'm not the only one who's experiencing a hard time. I can be there. I may not be able to do as much as I used to be able to do at a certain point or in COVID times, but I can take a call sometimes. And the last piece, which is not from my tradition, but I borrow it from the Shia tradition, which is and I hope I don't mess this up, every place is Karbala and every day is Ashura. Every day is Ashura and every place is Karbala. And that's a reference to a very momentous moment in Islamic history where there's this incredible injustice and violence that happens. And part of the Shia commitment to justice seeking is that everywhere, like we need to seek justice everywhere and for everyone. And that keeps me, and the self-compassion also, that as I worship a God that I call the compassionate or the most compassionate one. And, but I have to be reminded that I myself, like that compassion consciousness that I'm seeking is not just for others, it's also for myself. I deserve that compassion no more, no less than anybody else.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. You know, Reverend Crumpler, Erica, both of you talked about policy considerations in your remarks. We just had a national election, and in that election, I think 5 more states legalized marijuana. So now we have more states than we've ever had before with legal marijuana. And then you also had Oregon, for the first time ever, legalized small amounts of heroin and cocaine. Policy-wise, are we headed in the right direction as a country to reduce substance use disorders within our country? I'm absolutely an advocate for the decriminalization of substances, and the data suggests that, you know, when you stop telling people, you know, what they can't have or what they can't do, then the outcomes are better. And so, given what we've seen, where we're headed, are we headed in the right direction? What are some other policy considerations that we should be mindful of as we try to move to a more whole, more well society? And this will be our final question, and then we'll wrap up.
I also, there was a question in the Q&A that I wanted to address really, really quickly around those who are in the digital divide and how might we, you know, what words of wisdom. I think that, you know, yeah, I'm mindful of the fact that, you know, as a middle-aged, you know, professional, like I have an apartment that's roomy and it has 2 bedrooms, and my partner works in one and I work out in the living room, as you know, you can tell as cats and stuff from around, that is a privilege. And so I think that is something to keep naming. And I think that is a responsibility that faith communities and community-centered institutions need to name. I think that, and I think that we need to be equitable in how we you know, make spaces available. You know, sometimes, you know, making sure that folks are included if they're on the phone, if you will, making sure that we're not just focused on those who are on video and showing, just making sure that we have closed captions available All of these like tools and resources are great. But really quickly speaking to Ulysses' question, oh, great. I think that marijuana use and addiction are like substance use and addiction are from my understanding are two separate things. And I think that the legalization of marijuana has more to do with criminalization than it has to do with care. And so I think that doing anything to like get rid of, abolish the criminal, incarceration system that we have is always a good thing. And just as alcohol is in my lifetime always been legal, that I don't believe has necessarily, I think that's totally different than alcoholism. So I think that anything that keeps, Black and brown bodies from an excuse for incarcerating Black and brown bodies who are usually impacted by marijuana offenses is a good thing.
I think it's a critical thing. And as long as we're not only talking about decriminalizing substances, but we're talking about decriminalizing the people who use those substances. So we're decriminalizing people who are Black and brown. We're decriminalizing HIV. We're decriminalizing poverty. We're decriminalizing all these things. Like that's it. I mean, that's where the root of this lies. And then also recognizing that these policies and legislation has a particular kind of range of impact. But again, it's the changing of hearts and minds. It's the changing of these cultures, that are punitive and all these things, and creating communities of care and compassion that don't need to stigmatize, that don't stigmatize folks. I think it's going to be a kind of joint effort of both those forces.
That's great. And that's a wonderful note for us to end on a positive note. I want to thank each and every one of you again for not only your expertise, but for your vulnerability, your lived experience. I think sometimes lived experience is better education than our formal training. And so I really am grateful for your willingness to be a part of these important conversations. I want to thank everyone. We had over 130 participants for this session. So I want to thank everyone who tuned in, everyone who asked questions and who shared. And we want to invite you to continue to engage this Faith Day of the 11th International Conference on Stigma. This afternoon, there will be another conversation around the framework for dialogue between faith leaders and people living with HIV as a tool to talk about how we begin to continue to reduce stigma. Likewise, we also want to invite you to the rest of the week's programming for the International Stigma Conference, as everything that you will hear and will be presented will be helpful for our lives, especially in this year. And then finally, we invite you to tune into a World AIDS Day interfaith service that will broadcast at the United States Conference on HIV and AIDS Facebook page on World AIDS Day, December 1st. We hope that you will join us for a multi-faith, inclusive word of prayer and praise as we commemorate this very important day. Again, thanks to all of you for your participation, and we look forward to making it through 2020 and going into 2021, hopefully better than we came into 2020. Thanks to everyone, and be blessed and take care.
Thank you all.